All right, it's time for another JavaScript aside. And this one will be about something that's often misunderstood when it comes to the JavaScript programming language, but something we need to understand in order to understand things we'll see in Node.js. This is prototypal inheritance and function constructors. For starters, big word alert, inheritance. That's when one object, one collection of name-value pairs, gets access to the properties and methods, that is, other name-value pairs, of another object. So, an object has properties and methods, values, and functions attached to it, and your object gets access to the properties and methods of that other object. It inherits those other properties and methods. However, the way JavaScript implements the idea of inheritance is a bit different than other programming languages, major programming languages out there, but also very powerful because of its simplicity. It implements what's called prototypal inheritance. To explain, let's imagine an object that we have that has some property, some value, like we showed first name, last name, that's a property. And we access that property perhaps using the dot operator, the obj.prop1. Now, every object has a property that actually points to another object. It's the object's prototype. It's the thing it inherits from. It's a different object that it will then have access to that other object's properties and methods. And so we could actually say obj.prop2, whatever that other property is on the prototype, and we'll get access to it as if it was directly attached to my object. And the prototype also might point to a prototype, its own prototype, a different object, which might have its own properties and methods, and we can still take my object and say dot, whatever property name, and we'll still have access to it. So it's not just what's directly connected to my object, but down what's called the prototype chain. I have a sequence of objects connected to each other, and I can access properties on any of those objects down the line without having to specify which one it is. This is prototypal inheritance. And interestingly, I could make another object, a separate object, and it could point to the same prototype as other objects do. So they can share properties and methods, and I could change the property or method or add a new property or method to the prototype. And to every object that inherits from it, every object that points to it as its prototype, will instantly get access to it. Now, the question is, how do we manage building this prototype chain and constructing our objects? We've already seen the object literal syntax for creating objects, but there are a few ways to create objects in JavaScript that allow us to manage what the prototype is, what object will be the prototype of the object that I'm creating so I can get access to its properties and methods. There's the new ES6 class keyword. This idea of creating objects based on what's called a class. When we're talking about Node.js, we're going to be looking at something called function constructors. This is another way to create objects and manage what the prototypes are. What are the objects that the objects I'm creating use as their prototype? So let's take a quick look at that. And function constructors, well, big word alert. Function constructors. A normal function that is used to construct objects. So we build a function. However, the this keyword that shows up in JavaScript all the time will actually point automatically to a new empty object. And then we can add properties and methods to that new empty object, and that object is returned from the function automatically. And we do this by using the new keyword. So I can say new and then call the function. And what that will do is execute the function. It will take the this keyword, make that a new empty object. We can then use the this keyword to construct our object, adding properties and methods to it. And then the function constructor will automatically return that new object from that function call. All right, let's take a quick look. Once again, I have an empty app.js file, and we'll create a function constructor. Now, a function constructor is just a regular function. I'll use a capital letter to remind myself that it's a constructor. But when this function constructor is called with the new keyword, the this variable will automatically be an empty object, and then I can attach things to it. So I might pass into my function constructor some values that I want my object to have. Let's do first name, last name. And then I'll say this dot first name equals first name. So I'll create a new property on this new empty object, another new property on this new empty object, and set them equal to what I pass to the function as parameters. And then I can say, let's say John equals new person. And then I'll say John as the first name and Doe. Because I use the new keyword, when it executes this function, it does that special thing of making the this variable an empty object, and it automatically returns it. So the object I just created, I added properties to, will be returned here. So if I try that, I can actually say John dot first name. And then if I go to my command line, and I'll just run this JS file in Node, there it is. So my object was created. And it has those properties I attached to it. And what about the prototype? The thing that this new object I created, John, can inherit from. Well, JavaScript provides a way to do this. It's a little confusing, but person.prototype. Remember that functions are special kinds of objects, so I can have properties and methods on functions as well. And there's a built-in one called prototype. That's just an object, just another object. But I can attach properties and methods to this prototype object as well. So let's make a greet method using a function expression. And I'll just do what we did last time. I'll console.log hello first name last name. But instead I'm going to say this dot first name, so I know that I'm talking about the object, not some variable. It's there. So I have a greet function on the prototype. What happens when you use a function constructor is that any object created from the function constructor, its prototype will point to the prototype property of the function that you used to construct the object. So it's a little confusing because the name is prototype, but this isn't the prototype of person. It's the prototype of any objects created from person. So I can now say john.greet, and the JavaScript engine will search down the prototype chain because there is no greet method on John itself, but there is on its prototype. And then call it. So if I run this, hello John Doe. So whenever you see this .prototype property in code, you know what's happening is we're adding some methods and properties to be available to all objects created from this particular function constructor. See, I can create another new person. Let's say Jane Doe. And Jane also hits access to the greet method because the Jane object's prototype is this same prototype object, which has the greet on it. So there's Jane Doe and John Doe. And we can actually look at what the prototype is. This is not recommended to use or do in any real production code, but just to show it, there's a special proto in the V8 JavaScript engine that lets me see what the actual prototype object is of an object that I'm working with. So if I was to output these, notice they're both that prototype object that has the greet function on it. The proto of John and Jane is this prototype object defined as attached to the function constructor, and it has the greet method on it. And this proto property for these two objects should be the exact same object because they were both created from the same function constructor. And I can double check that by saying, is Jane.proto and John.proto the same object? Notice I'm asking, are they equal? Are they the same? And if I run this, I get true. So both Jane and John have a prototype, which is this object, person.prototype, what's defined there. And so they both thus have access to the greet method because the JavaScript engine searches down the prototype chain to allow John and Jane, any objects created from this person function constructor, to have access to inherit these properties and methods from any of those prototypes down the chain. So if this person.prototype also had a prototype with a different method on it or a property, the objects would still have access to those as well. But the point that we're making here is when you see .prototype, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about objects and attaching other methods and properties to make available to those objects. All right, that's enough for prototypal inheritance and function constructors. Let's move on.